Nia Caldwell was supposed to be invisible tonight. Just an overlooked archivist in an emerald gown, trying to survive a ballroom full of hostile, whispering elites. They thought she didn't belong. They thought she wasn't paying attention. But while the entire room was busy ignoring her, Nia was the only one watching the server's hands. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate was a masterclass in suffocating opulence, a glittering sea of snakes wrapped in designer silk and bespoke tailoring. Thousands of hand-cut crystal prisms cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, casting a fractured, icy light over the elite guests who moved across the polished marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of expensive, heavy perfumes and the quiet, continuous clinking of gold tableware. Yet, beneath the elegant string quartet playing in the corner and the soft hum of practiced laughter, there was a sharp, underlying current of hostility. Nia Caldwell felt every single ounce of it pressing down on her shoulders. Standing perfectly still near the heavy velvet drapery at the edge of the room, she was the only black woman in the ballroom, and the crowd was making absolutely sure she knew it. She was here on professional obligation, representing the historical archive society that depended entirely on the fickle charity of the billionaires in this very room. She had spent a month's salary renting the stunning emerald green evening gown that draped beautifully over her frame, its fabric subtly shimmering under the chandelier lights, hoping to project an armor of grace. Instead, the dress only seemed to highlight her as an outsider. Everywhere she looked, cold eyes darted her way. She caught the condescending sneers of older women covered in diamonds, and the dismissive, lingering stares of men in black tuxedos who whispered behind their crystal champagne flutes as they walked past. They did not see a brilliant, highly educated archivist. They saw an intrusion. They saw someone who did not belong in their pristine, guarded world. Used to the suffocating pressure of these predominantly white, elite spaces, Nia employed her oldest survival tactic. She shrank herself into the shadows and became an observer. Her mind, trained to catalog historical artifacts and read between the lines of ancient documents, began to catalog the room. She noticed the fake, strained smiles of the politicians, the nervous twitch in the gala host's jaw, and the way the wait staff moved with terrified precision. She held her breath, keeping one hand resting delicately near her chest to steady her racing heart. She wanted nothing more than to slip out the back doors, call a cab, and escape the crushing weight of their disapproval. But she refused to be bullied out of doing her job. So, she stood her ground, wrapping her dignity around her like a shield, pretending not to hear the cruel, hushed murmurs circulating just feet away from her. She watched the room with sharp, expressive eyes, convinced that the worst part of the evening was simply enduring the agonizing isolation. She had no idea that the night had not even truly begun. The heavy, stifling atmosphere of the ballroom did not gradually fade. It was abruptly and violently severed. It started at the grand entrance. The classical music faltered, the cellist missing a note as the heavy mahogany doors were suddenly pushed open by four men in immaculate black suits. They moved with a synchronized, predatory discipline, fanning out across the perimeter of the room. They were not standard gala security. Their athletic builds and coldly sweeping eyes spoke of private military training and absolute loyalty. A sudden, terrifying silence swept across the ballroom like a shockwave. The arrogant whispers died in the throats of the elite. The clinking of crystal stopped entirely. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet as the crowd parted, instinctively pressing themselves back against the banquet tables as if making way for a predator. Then Zhao Jin walked through the doors. He did not rush and he did not smile. Tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating an almost lethal aura of power, the legendary crime lord commanded the entire room without uttering a single syllable. He was a man in his late 30s, possessing a striking, commanding presence with a sharp jawline and intensely defined cheekbones. His black hair was slicked back neatly, reinforcing a powerful executive look that blended high society wealth with the dark, untouchable reality of his underworld syndicate. He wore a luxury black tuxedo with a crisp white dress shirt and a perfectly fitted tie, yet on him the formal wear looked less like a celebration and more like armor. Every step he took was measured and dominant, echoing softly in the absolute silence he had commanded just by existing. From her vantage point by the velvet drapes, Nia watched the transformation of the room with absolute fascination. The same arrogant, sneering elites who had spent the last hour looking down on her were now trembling. The host of the gala, a man who had intentionally bumped into Nia earlier without apologizing, was now sweating profusely, bowing his head in sickeningly subservient deference as Zhao Jin approached the center of the ballroom. Nia observed the crime lord's clean-shaven face and his dark, focused eyes that swept over the crowd with cold calculation. He lived behind an impenetrable wall of intimidation, trusting no one, isolated not by a lack of belonging, but by an excess of absolute power. In a strange, unspoken way, Nia realized they were the two most isolated people in the room, she out of place by design of their prejudice and he separated from them by their sheer, unadulterated fear. Zhao Jin took his place near the head table, his posture upright and impossibly calm, completely unaware that his arrival had just set the stage for an execution. Nia watched from the periphery as Zhao Jin took his designated seat at the center of the grand head table. The atmosphere in the room had fundamentally altered, shifting from relaxed arrogance to a tight, suffocating tension. Every movement made by the elite guests was now carefully measured, every laugh stifled or abruptly cut short. Zhao Jin did not engage in the sycophantic small talk that usually define these galas. He sat with perfect imposing posture, his dark eyes casually scanning the ballroom with the detached precision of a predator assessing a flock of nervous birds. The host of the evening, a billionaire property developer with a reputation for ruthless backroom dealings, sat to Zhao Jin's right. To the untrained eye, the host appeared the picture of gracious hospitality, projecting a wide, welcoming smile and gesturing expansively as he spoke. But Nia was an archivist. Her entire career was built on noticing the microscopic details that others overlooked. The slight tremor in a signature, the unnatural spacing in a forged document, the hidden truths buried under layers of official presentation. She saw the truth written all over the host's body language. His smile did not reach his eyes. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. His fingers drummed a frantic, erratic rhythm against his thigh, completely hidden beneath the draped white tablecloth, but visible to Nia from her specific angle by the velvet curtains. He was projecting confidence, but beneath the tailored suit, the man was practically vibrating with terror. The main banquet service concluded, and the room began to quiet down for the midnight toast, the centerpiece of the gala. A line of waitstaff emerged from the kitchen corridors, moving in perfect synchronization, bearing silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes. Nia watched as the lead waiter, a man whose posture was slightly too rigid, approached the head table. The host stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his glass to command the room's attention. All eyes drifted toward the billionaire, but Nia's eyes stayed locked on the waiter's hands. It was a masterclass in misdirection. While the host loudly praised Zhao Jin's supposed contributions to the city's philanthropic ventures, drawing the collective gaze of the ballroom to his own sweeping gestures, the waiter moved to serve the crime lord. From the hidden, shadowed recess of his silver serving tray, the waiter's hand darted out. He bypassed the front row of pristine, sparkling champagne flutes and smoothly extracted a single, specific glass from the back. To anyone else, it looked like a seamless part of the service. But Nia's hypervigilant eyes caught the anomaly. The liquid inside that specific glass lacked the effervescent, golden clarity of the others. It was duller, heavier, and caught the chandelier light with a faint, sickly refraction. The waiter stepped back, leaving the tainted crystal glass resting exactly inches from Zhao Jin's right hand. The crime lord had not noticed. His sharp gaze was fixed on the host, analyzing the man's overly enthusiastic speech. The realization hit Nia with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. This wasn't just a gala, it was an execution. The hostility she had felt all night from these elites wasn't just snobbery, it was the collective, toxic arrogance of people who believed they could orchestrate a murder in a crowded room and get away with it. She stared at the heavy, dull liquid in the glass. The host raised his own flute, signaling the end of his speech. The countdown had begun. If Zhao Jin's fingers touched that glass, he was going to die right in front of her. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. A violent, internal war raged inside Nia's mind. Every survival instinct she had honed in these elite, predominantly white spaces screamed at her to stay perfectly still, to remain the invisible archivist by the velvet drapes. If she intervened, she would shatter the fragile armor she had worn all night. She would draw the terrifying, hostile gaze of hundreds of billionaires directly onto herself. Worse, she would be throwing herself into the middle of a syndicate assassination. But as she looked at Zhao Jin, she realized something profound. For all his wealth, for all the heavily armed bodyguards standing at the perimeter of the room, he was completely exposed. He was isolated in his power, surrounded by smiling faces that masked deadly intentions. If she did nothing, she would be complicit. She would have to live the rest of her life knowing she stood by and watched a man be murdered simply because she was too afraid to take up space. Nia's hands balled into tight fists, the silk of her emerald gown bunching in her grip. She took a deep breath, forcing the air into her trembling lungs, and stepped away from the shadows. The physical act of moving across the grand ballroom felt like wading through deep, freezing water. Her high heels clicked softly against the polished marble, a rhythmic countdown that mirrored the frantic beating of her heart. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the tainted crystal glass resting on the white tablecloth. She moved with a sudden, desperate fluidity, weaving gracefully between the round banquet tables, slipping past guests who were too distracted by the host's concluding remarks to notice the lone black woman abandoning her post. The distance between the velvet drapes and the head table had never felt so vast. With every step, the sheer insanity of what she was doing threatened to overwhelm her. She was unarmed, unconnected, and entirely out of her depth, marching straight into the crosshairs of a billionaire's murder plot. The host raised his glass high into the air. "To new partnerships," he proclaimed loudly, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Zhao Jin shifted his weight, his large, perfectly manicured hand reaching out slowly toward the tainted champagne flute. Nia lunged. She abandoned all pretense of high society decorum, closing the final few feet with a sudden, urgent burst of speed. She intercepted the waiter just as he was turning away to retreat, stepping directly into his path and throwing him off balance. Before Zhao Jin's fingers could even brush the stem of his drink, Nia's hand darted across the white tablecloth. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, heavy crystal of the poisoned glass. She snatched it away from the crime lord's reach with such force that a few drops of the dull liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. "Excuse me," Nia said, her voice shaking violently but carrying a desperate, ringing clarity that cut through the polite murmurs of the surrounding tables. She clutched the poisoned glass to her chest, her knuckles turning white. "I believe this is mine." The waiter froze, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic as he stared at the empty space on the tablecloth. Beside him, Zhao Jin's hand hovered in the air, his intense, dark eyes snapping toward Nia with razor-sharp confusion. But it was the reaction of the host that shattered the remaining tension in the room. The billionaire's fake, expansive smile vanished instantly, replaced by a contortion of absolute, primal horror. He stared at Nia, staring at the emerald dress, staring at the glass clutched against her heart, realizing in real time that his perfect, untraceable assassination had just been hijacked by the one person in the room he had completely ignored. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the grand ballroom. The elegant string quartet, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere, allowed their music to screech to an abrupt and jagged halt. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously, crystal flutes pausing midway to their lips. Every single pair of eyes in the opulent space locked onto Nia Caldwell. The hostility she had felt earlier in the evening was nothing compared to this. This was the collective, burning outrage of the elite, staring in visceral disgust at the woman who had dared to desecrate their most important ritual. Standing at the head table, clutching the poisoned glass, Nia had never felt so terrifyingly exposed. The host's panic rapidly transmuted into explosive, venomous rage. He realized instantly that if he didn't control the narrative in the next 3 seconds, his life was over. He slammed his hands down onto the banquet table, the gold tableware rattling violently against the porcelain plates. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" he roared, the sheer volume of his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He stepped away from his chair, aggressively invading Nia's personal space. His face was flushed a deep, mottled red, his eyes bulging with a terrifying mixture of fear and fury. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at her face. "How dare you interrupt this toast? Who let you anywhere near this table?" Nia took a physical step back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but her grip on the glass remained like a vice. I was just taking my drink," she stammered, fighting to keep her voice steady against the tidal wave of his aggression. "Your drink?" the host spat, his lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered classist contempt. He turned his body slightly, ensuring the entire ballroom was hanging on his every word, using the crowd's prejudice as his ultimate weapon. "You don't even belong in this room. You are a nobody, an uninvited trespasser who has snuck into a private event to cause a scene." He turned his furious gaze toward the perimeter of the room, his voice cracking with desperation. "Security, get in here immediately. I want this woman removed from my property right now." The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, outraged whispers, and cruel murmurs. The elite guests looked at Nia with open disdain, perfectly willing to believe the host's narrative. To them, she was the disruption, the outsider who had ruined their elegant evening. The weight of their collective judgment threatened to crush her into the marble floor. From the shadows of the arched doorways, 2 massive security guards in dark suits immediately broke into a sprint. They charged across the ballroom floor, their faces set in grim, violent determination, closing the distance to the head table in a matter of seconds. Their large, heavy hands reached out, fully intending to grab Nia's bare arms, drag her forcefully out of the ballroom, and silence her forever in the cold alleyway out back. Nia squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the brutal physical impact, the terrified realization washing over her that she had sacrificed herself for absolutely nothing. She had stopped the poison, but the host was going to win anyway. They were going to throw her to the wolves, dispose of the glass, and Zhao Jin would never know how close he came to dying. The heavy footsteps of the guards thundered in her ears, mere inches away as they lunged to tear her away from the table. But the hands never touched her. The heavy hands of the charging security guards never made contact with Nia's skin. A single sharp syllable sliced through the chaotic, hyperventilating atmosphere of the grand ballroom, freezing the violence in its tracks. Stop. The word was not shouted. It was delivered with a low, resonant calm, yet it carried the devastating, undeniable weight of an executioner's gavel. The two massive guards, mere inches from grabbing Nia by the shoulders, hit the brakes so abruptly that the soles of their polished shoes audibly skidded against the marble floor. They recoiled instantly, their faces draining of color as they looked past Nia toward the head table. The entire ballroom, which just seconds ago had been a chorus of outraged classist murmurs, fell into a suffocating absolute silence. No one breathed. No one moved. The classical musicians in the corner stood perfectly still, clutching their instruments as if moving them might trigger an explosion. Zhao Jin slowly pushed his chair back. He stood to his full, imposing height, taking a moment to casually button the front of his luxury black tuxedo. Every eye in the cavernous room was anchored to him, but his dark, intense gaze was locked entirely on the host. The crime lord did not project the frantic, sweaty aggression of the billionaire property developer. Zhao Jin radiated a cold, lethal serenity that was infinitely more terrifying. Without breaking eye contact with the host, he stepped down from the dais. The rhythmic, measured sound of his footsteps echoed like a metronome in the dead silent room. He bypassed his own heavily armed bodyguards, who had silently shifted their stances into combat-ready positions the moment their boss stood up, and walked directly toward Nia. The host's face contorted into a mask of desperate confusion. "Mr. Zhao," he stammered, his voice pitching up an octave, the false bravado cracking completely. "Please accept my deepest apologies. This woman is an uninvited trespasser. She is disturbed. I am having her removed from the premises immediately so we may continue our celebration." Zhao Jin ignored him entirely. He closed the final distance and stepped squarely in front of Nia, deliberately inserting his broad shoulders between her and the host, shielding her from the hostile glare of the room. It was an unmistakable, deeply instinctual gesture of protection. He looked down at Nia, taking in her trembling frame, the shimmering emerald gown, and the sheer, unadulterated terror in her expressive eyes. But beneath that terror, he saw a spine of absolute steel. He looked at her hands, gripped so tightly around the heavy crystal champagne flute that her knuckles were entirely white. His razor-sharp mind processed the scene in a fraction of a second. The interruption. The specific glass. The host's profound panic. He understood exactly what she had done and exactly what she had risked to do it. Zhao Jin turned his head slightly, just enough to cast his dark, imposing gaze over the host and the breathless, trembling elites who had spent the entire evening making this woman feel like an outcast. His voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth, quiet, and echoed with absolute, untouchable authority. "She is with me." The declaration hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. The host physically staggered back a step, all the blood rushing from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. The elite guests, who had just spent the last 5 minutes whispering cruel insults about the lone black woman in the room, suddenly dropped their gazes, a wave of profound, sickening dread washing over them. They had just tried to forcefully throw out a woman personally claimed by the most dangerous syndicate boss in the hemisphere. Zhao Jin didn't care about the crowd's sudden terror. He turned his attention back to Nia. With deliberate, terrifying gentleness, he reached out his large, perfectly manicured hand and placed it over hers. He didn't pry her fingers open. He simply waited until the steady, grounding warmth of his grip coaxed her to release the glass. Nia exhaled a shaky breath, stepping back slightly as Zhao Jin took the tainted champagne flute from her hands. He held it up to the light of the crystal chandeliers. The liquid inside was heavy, lacking the golden, effervescent sparkle of the others. Zhao Jin's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. He had survived 2 decades in the criminal underworld. He knew what death looked like when it was poured into crystal. He turned slowly back to the host, extending his arm and offering the glass to the trembling billionaire. "You interrupted your own toast," Zhao Jin said, his voice dropping to a terrifying silken whisper. "A toast to new partnerships, I believe you said. It would be a profound disrespect to leave such a fine vintage untouched. Drink." The host's eyes bulged, his gaze darting frantically from the glass to Zhao Jin's impassive face, and then to the perimeter of the room. But there was no salvation to be found. Zhao Jin's elite bodyguards had seamlessly moved inward, silently blocking every exit from the ballroom. The host was entirely boxed in. The billionaire opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of excuse, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, but his vocal cords completely seized. Sweat poured down the sides of his face, soaking into the stiff collar of his expensive dress shirt. His hands shook violently as he raised them, palms out, taking another desperate step backward. I cannot, Mr. Zhao," the host wheezed, his facade completely disintegrating before the eyes of the city's most powerful people. "I have a medical condition. The alcohol, it interacts with my medication. Please, I beg of you, drink it," Zhao Jin commanded, the volume of his voice rising just a fraction, echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The host broke. The realization that his perfect, untraceable assassination had failed, and worse, that the target now possessed the murder weapon in his hand, shattered the billionaire's mind. He fell to his knees on the polished marble floor, letting out a pathetic, ragged sob, clutching at the tablecloth as he cowered before the crime lord. The refusal was absolute. There was no need for a laboratory, no need for toxicology reports or police interrogations. The host's sheer visceral terror of the liquid in that glass was the only confession Zhao Jin required. The entire ballroom watched in stunned, paralyzed horror as one of their own, a titan of high society, wept like a broken child on the floor, his treachery exposed for the world to see. Zhao Jin stared down at the pathetic figure for a long, silent moment, his expression devoid of any mercy or pity. With a casual, almost dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed the crystal flute onto the floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, violent crash, the tainted liquid splashing across the pristine marble and soaking into the hem of the host's tailored trousers. The sound made half the room physically jump, but Zhao Jin did not even blink. He had already dismissed the man from his reality. The host was a dead man walking, his empire and his life extinguished the moment the glass hit the floor. Having concluded the business of his own survival, Zhao Jin turned his back on the ruined host. He looked at Nia, the coldness in his eyes melting away, replaced by a look of profound, silent reverence. This woman, an archivist, an outsider, a civilian with absolutely no connection to his dark, violent world, had recognized a threat his own highly paid security detail had missed. More importantly, she had risked her own life, her dignity, and her freedom in a room full of people who hated her, simply to save a man she did not know. In a life built entirely on transactional relationships, fear, and bought loyalty, her uncalculated bravery was the most stunning thing he had ever witnessed. Zhao Jin offered her his arm, bowing his head just a fraction in a gesture of absolute, unfeigned respect. Nia looked at his extended arm, her heart still beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the shattered glass on the floor, at the weeping billionaire, and then at the sea of elite guests who were now cowering in the shadows. The suffocating weight of their disapproval had completely evaporated, replaced by a palpable, suffocating fear. She took a deep, steadying breath, lifting her chin high. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. With effortless, natural elegance, she placed her hand delicately on the sleeve of Zhao Jin's tuxedo. Together they began to walk. The journey across the grand ballroom felt entirely different this time. As the Chinese crime lord and the black archivist moved toward the heavy mahogany doors, the crowd practically scrambled to get out of their way. The same older women covered in diamonds who had sneered at Nia earlier now pressed themselves against the banquet tables, their eyes cast downward in absolute terror. The men in black tuxedos who had whispered insults behind their champagne flutes now bowed their heads submissively, not daring to make eye contact with the woman who had just been elevated to the most untouchable status in the city. Zhao Jin's bodyguards fell into a perfect, protective diamond formation around them as they reached the exit. The grand mahogany doors were pulled open by the staff, revealing the cool, crisp night air outside. Nia walked out of the opulent, toxic estate not as an overlooked outcast, but as royalty. She had entered the gala invisible and isolated, but she left it completely transformed, fiercely protected by a legendary king of the underworld, leaving the broken elite to choke on their own shattered arrogance. 6 months later, the memory of that suffocating, toxic gala at the Beaumont estate felt like a fever dream from a distant lifetime. Nia Caldwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her top-floor office, the afternoon sunlight catching the sharp, confident lines of her tailored cream-colored suit. She was no longer an overlooked, underpaid archivist shrinking herself into the shadows to appease people who hated her. She was the founder and lead director of the city's premier historical provenance and authentication firm. Her office was a sanctuary of sleek mahogany, modern glass, and towering shelves of rare antiquities, a physical manifestation of a woman who had finally decided to take up the space she so richly deserved. She looked down at the sprawling metropolis below, taking a slow, steadying breath. The city had not changed, but her place within it had been entirely rewritten. The social hierarchy of the elite had completely inverted itself in the aftermath of the shattered champagne glass. The same billionaires and high society matrons who had sneered at her emerald gown and whispered cruel classist insults behind their hands now spent months languishing on her firm's waiting list. They sent lavish floral arrangements and desperately polite emails, practically begging for her consulting services. Nia handled them all with a freezing, impeccable professionalism. She knew exactly why they were suddenly so eager to court her favor, and it had nothing to do with their sudden appreciation for her archival brilliance. It was the invisible, impenetrable shield of absolute terror that surrounded her name. The entire underworld, and the high society that secretly funded it, knew that Nia Caldwell was the most untouchable woman in the hemisphere. She belonged to no one, but she was fiercely, violently protected by a legendary king. The heavy oak doors of her office swung open, breaking the quiet hum of the afternoon. There were no aggressive security guards rushing in to secure the perimeter, because the man stepping over the threshold understood that this was her empire, not his. Zhao Jin walked into the sunlit room, his presence as imposing and gravity-shifting as ever. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, radiating the kind of absolute wealth and control that routinely toppled syndicates. But as the heavy doors clicked shut behind him, sealing them away from the rest of the world, the terrifying, lethal edge of the Chinese crime lord subtly melted away. The impenetrable walls he kept between himself and the rest of humanity simply did not exist in this room. He didn't take a seat behind her desk. Instead, he crossed the plush carpet and joined her by the sweeping glass windows, moving with that familiar, quiet grace. In his hands he carried a slim, leather-bound portfolio, a collection of perfectly authenticated 18th-century architectural blueprints she had casually mentioned wanting a month ago. He offered them to her without a word, a quiet gesture of deep respect and unparalleled resources. Nia took the portfolio, her fingers brushing against his, a genuine warm smile breaking across her face. In a life built entirely on extortion, fear, and calculated violence, Zhao Jin had finally found something completely incorruptible. She had saved his life without asking for a single favor, without calculating the angles, stepping into the crosshairs of a loaded gun simply because her fierce integrity had demanded it. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the glittering skyline. It was not a relationship forged by the traditional toxic dynamics of the criminal underworld. He did not control her. He merely ensured that no one else in the world would ever have the power to control her again. He had given her the frictionless safety to build her own enterprise, and in return she gave him the rarest commodity in his dark, isolated universe: absolute, unbought loyalty. They were two outsiders, one rejected by the bright lights of high society, the other ruling from the pitch-black depths of the syndicate, who had forged an unbreakable alliance. As Zhao Jin turned his head to look at her, the coldness of his violent world completely forgotten in the warmth of her presence, they both knew the truth. They had brought the arrogant elites to their knees, and they had conquered the city together.